What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Modern video, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Ruby Storm deck for the Modern format. Arguably, and maybe not even arguably, probably just one of the best Game 1 decks to be playing in the format currently, just from the speed of the deck, and normally decks aren't really playing much like main deck hate for Storm, like the really, really good hate for Storm, just because it's not really like viable main deck options. But it's a deck that can definitely kill you on speed, and if you put the shields down for even a moment, it has the potential to just outright win the game. And there's even times where the ring protection will not help you when playing this deck. So we're going to be going over, of course, the Storm deck. We looked at it just before the Pro Tour, where it was really kind of spiking up in usage, and of course had a very terrible performance at the Pro Tour, had like a less than 40% win rate, and that was being played by some of the best players in the format. So why has Ruby Storm now all of a sudden become a deck that, you know, people are able to play and, you know, are willing to kind of go out of their way to play? So, of course, before we get too deep into the deck and we ramble on any longer, if you're already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we dive into the Modern and Pioneer format, as well as some other longer form videos pertaining to those formats, sometimes not, we just like to have a lot of fun on the channel and looking to expand into more content, maybe doing some standard stuff on Arena. So if you want to be around for that, if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. Of course, if you travel down to the description of the video, you will see a link to my Discord server. You can follow me on Twitter as well. My Twitter handle is down there. If that is, again, something that interests you, I'm going to be focusing a lot on the Pioneer as we get ready for the regional championship in Washington, D.C. And if for whatever reason you're going to be there, there's going to be an SCG con going on as well as the regional championship on that same weekend. So, I'm planning on being there Saturday and Sunday. So if you see me, whatever, you want to look out for me, anything like that, I would appreciate it. Well, I guess rather, I'm open for, meeting up with people, talking for a little bit, all that fun, happy stuff while I'm out there. But, with all that, the clerical, administrative stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about Ruby Storm. Because this is a deck that I think for a lot of people, Storm has been like a very contentious topic or a contentious, archetype that has existed in Modern for a long time. It's essentially one of the original archetypes where instead of just banning the cards outright that allow the deck to exist, we essentially ban around it, which we've seen from, a history of like really good rituals getting the axe or some other cards that kind of help the Storm deck kind of go off. I even have like a whole video kind of detailing a little bit of the history of Storm and how it's changed over the years, which of course won't really include this recent resurgence that we've had. But nonetheless, Storm has been like the original deck where we ban around it instead of banning it, and here it is making an impact. And I had it like essentially bordering on like that tier 1 status in my tier video, which you can check out as well. So exactly what is Ruby Storm trying to do? Ideally, you end up sticking a Ruby Medallion or a Ral Monsoon Mage onto the battlefield, both having kind of their benefits of being in play that essentially reduce the cost of all of your important spells in your deck. So Ral Monsoon Mage obviously is probably the better, quote-unquote, of the two options just because of the backside of Leyline Prodigy. So it's a 1 and a red for 1/3. Instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell during your turn, you flip a coin. If you lose the flip, it deals 1 damage to you. If you win the flip, you may exile a Ral, return to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, and then it enters the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter on it for each instant sorcery spell you've cast this turn. So ideally, you end up casting enough instant sorcery spells, you win a flip with Ral Monsoon Mage to transform into Leyline Prodigy so that you can instantly ultimate him for his -8, which is going to allow you to exile the top 8 cards of your library, and then you can cast instants and sorcery spells from among them this turn without paying their mana cost. So ideally, you can get to that point. There are turns where you can just like cast a bunch of spells, just kind of set up and everything like that. If you're not worried about your opponent like nuking your graveyard or anything like that, you can just kind of set up a turn where you can flip Rao off of maybe like 6 or 7 different, or I guess rather like 5 instant sorceries. It'll flip with 7 loyalty on it. You can plus to, make your instant sorceries cost 1 less to kind of keep that effect going, and then the next turn be able to ultimate and kind of kick things off from there. I say that this one, it's arguable like where Ruby Medallion or Ral is better. I think Ruby Medallion on turn 2 is specifically better for one. Like aside from Besejus and things like that, people aren't really going to have any way to deal with like a Ruby Medallion pretty early that isn't also going to benefit you in some way. And this allowing just your red spells flat out to cost 1 less to cast mean that you can on turn 3 play your 3rd land, play a Raoul Monsoon Mage off of 1 mana, and then you're kind of off to the races. You can cast some of these more expensive spells for incredibly cheap thanks to Raoul plus Ruby Medallion. Plus Ruby Medallions also stack pretty nicely as well to kind of just make some of these spells, and of course some of the cards on your sideboard, a lot cheaper as well. So so this is like what we're trying to assemble. We're trying to get a Ruby Medallion and a Raoul Monsoon Mage. Ideally, we can get both on the battlefield pretty easily on turn 3 with some mana to spare. This deck does have some like avenues to like a turn 2 or turn 3 kill, where you can like strike it rich on turn 1 and then play like a Ruby Medallion on turn 2 and then start casting, Desperate Ritual, Manamorphose, and Pyretic Ritual, which are going to start netting you mana. Of course, you can use Manamorphose to kind of fix your colors of mana, so then if you have to go to the sideboard and go and get like a Silent Static Prison or Wispmare, you're able to kind of cast those cards as well. But generally, a lot of the time, you just need tons of red mana because 99% of your spells are red throughout your entire deck, and then all of your spells are red in the main deck. So you're playing a bunch of rituals, then you're casting, Reckless Impulse, Ren's Resolve, Glimpse the Impossible. These all exile cards from the top of your library, and then in the case of like Reckless Impulse and Ren's Resolve, until the end of your next turn, you can play those cards, and then Glimpse the Impossible. You can only cast those until your end of turn, but these do put the cards back into your graveyard, and for each card you put back into your graveyard, you can make Scions. Spawns. The Scions have power. These just make some 0/1s that can sacrifice to add a colorless mana. So, like, in a way, this can kind of ramp you. This can give you some extra mana to kind of play with on your turns if you think that maybe you're going to be a little short. This allows you to kind of, get some card advantage when you need it to on the turns that you go off, and the turns that you don't really need it is going to put the cards back in your graveyard, something that Reckless Impulse and Ren's Resolve aren't going to do if you aren't able to play or cast any of the cards that you have in exile with those by the time you get to your next end step. And while this does have a shorter leash, again, they go to the graveyard, helps out with Past in Flames, can, again, give you the bodies that you need to maybe chump block for like a turn to kind of set up to go off on the next turn, or just give you that extra mana that you need that we've been talking about. 2 Valakuts, Awakening, they let you put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library and then draw that many +1. So you can just like cast this for like 1 red and essentially, put no cards at the bottom and then draw a card. Or you can, if you have just a hand full of lands, which can happen when you're, casting Manamorphoses and, finding like, other draw spells and things like that off of like Reckless Impulse, or just again having those extra lands in hand. For like turn you go off, you can just put them to the bottom of your library, start drawing a bunch of cards, and further increase your likelihood of going off. Plus, this is being a land too is very nice when you just need to have your land drops because your opponent's able to kind of keep you off of Ruby Medallion or Rouse, or you just aren't naturally finding them off of your impulses or on your draw steps. Wish is something that kind of helps tie this deck together, as well as Past in Flames as well. You'll notice that there isn't a win condition in the deck necessarily. We're not seeing a Grape Shot or an Empty the Warrens or anything like that. It's all on the sideboard. So Wish helps us play a card that we own from outside of the game this turn. So you are able to play a Wish, go to your sideboard. You'll see like Grape Shots in here, and of course Empty the Warrens that we talked about that aren't in the main. With also some other options here that you can end up extending your combo, like the other Past in Flames. If you somehow don't find another Past in Flames, you're able to Wish, go and get Past in Flames, and then you're going to be able to flashback the Wish later after you play all of your rituals to then eventually go and get something like a Grape Shot and then Grape Shot your opponent to death. We see the Silences and Static Prisons. These are cards that you're more than likely just going to bring in rather than leave in the sideboard. But if you need these in game 1 when you're playing against Control, you can just go and get like a Silence. If they, they have to basically decide like, okay, am I going to counter the Wish? Am I going to counter the Silences? Like a way you can draw out like a counter spell as well. Also, you have like Wispmare here to destroy an enchantment. It gets around some of the potential like Chalice of the Void, things like that. It's also just like a very cheap enchantment removal option. But the rest of these cards, Blood Moon, you can lock your opponent out of the game. Alchemist Gambit is the way that you can get around ring protection, because of the fact that during your extra turn, or it says take an extra turn after this one, during that turn, damage can't be prevented, and then you exile Alchemist Gambit. You could also just pay the cleave cost, which is not necessarily ideal, because if you don't play the cleave cost, then at the beginning of that end step, that turn's end step, you'll lose the game. If you can cast it for its cleave cost, then you don't lose the game, you just get to take an extra turn, and then during that turn, damage can't be prevented. So it's like you're going to play a Gambit more than likely for its 3 CMC, and then go get an Empty of the Warrens, make as many Goblin tokens as you need to be able to attack through whatever your opponent has, and be able to win the game that way. And that's essentially like what the deck is trying to do in most of its games. Game 1, it gets to execute it pretty nicely, for the fact that typically decks don't have main deck graveyard hate. Of course, there's probably some oddball people that end up playing some sort of hate in their deck. Maybe they're playing like Urza Saga, they end up playing like a Soul Guide Lantern or whatever, or like a Nihil Spellbomb. Though that's definitely not common. That is like totally not out of the realm of possibility, but definitely something that is not normal, I would say, for most decks. So you kind of get to go off unimpeded in game 1s, and I can attest to that. Even having some pretty bad situations come up where, you're not winning the game on like turn 2 or turn 3, but, the game's going longer and longer, which I think would typically favor your opponent, especially if they're able to put like a relatively quick clock on you, and they're able to kind of disrupt, some of your cost reducers and force you to have to, have a ton of rituals to be able to cast a lot of these spells to then eventually find a reducer and flash, whatever. You can definitely win a lot of game 1s. I think when the RCQ that I played in, where I did terrible record-wise, I won every game 1. Even like the games where I won on turn 2 or turn 3, or the game went longer, I ended up winning those games. And the sideboard games were definitely a lot harder, whether just from my inexperience with the deck, which I think is super important, that you just, even if it's just gold fishing, and you just pretend like, okay, my opponent's going to have this hate card on turn 2, like, can I be faster than it, or how do I have to play around it so I can get it off the board as soon as possible, and then in that same turn also be able to kind of go off and win the game that way. So definitely when playing this deck, that's the thing that you have to think of is, how am I going to win the sideboarded games? You have a lot of chances to win those sideboarded games. Sometimes your opponent's going to have so much hate that it's going to be hard for you to play around it, but I think this deck can play around 1 or 2 pieces pretty comfortably, as long as you're able to sequence correctly and can kind of understand and give yourself the best possibility of playing around said cards. And when you're playing something like Static Prison, silences in the main, you're just able to like silence your opponent on their turns. But like if they're not playing counter spells or anything like that, silencing on their upkeep so that they can't play any spells that turn. And so it means they're not going to be able to play their Damping Spheres or their Trinispheres or anything like that, or even like locking them out of playing the ring, so then you could just untap, play a bunch of your spells, go flash them all back, go get a Grave Shot, whatever it is, out of your sideboard, and then kill them with a Grave Shot, or any different avenue that you have with this deck. So a lot of what Storm has done here recently to get better than obviously what it's been is that the sideboard looks like it's tuned a little bit less for the Wish package. Of course, you have a lot of good Wish targets in here, plenty of them, in fact. But the fact that you 3 silence, 4 Static Prison in the red-white version. There's some that play green. There's just a Izzet version. There's quite a few that can play, but all kind of have the same general idea, where you want cheap, efficient things to kind of get these hate pieces off the board. Where you see like Chalice on 2, it counters a lot of your spells, even if the cost is reduced. Its converted mana cost is still 2, so that if you cast it into a Chalice on 2, it's going to get countered. So you want kind of these answers. So we see things like Silence and Static Prison from the white version. We see things like Nature's Claim and like Veil of Summer from the green versions, and blue, just doing blue things, where they can just like bounce permanents or whatever for, a very cheap cost. So definitely for at least Ruby Storm, like a lot of your main deck is going to be, the stock, a bunch of Wishes, Past in Flames, Valakut Awakenings. Like these numbers are rarely going to shift here. It's more or less what your sideboard is going to look like, and to an extent what your mana base is going to look like, what whatever surveillance that you're going to end up playing, and what fetch lands you're going to play, which mainly kind of stays the same because you're going to play the red surveil lands, and you're just going to want the red fetch lands in your deck. So yeah, like I think that as the format has kind of moved on, and we're kind of more or less in a way out of this racing phase, even though I think Boros and all these other decks do kind of do something very powerful very early on. I think that Ruby Storm is just the one that if you're not going to interact with it, it can absolutely just win the game on turn 2. And I think in particular, this deck doesn't necessarily have to assemble a critical mass. Like if you just have 2-3 lands, a cost reducer, and then like a bunch of rituals and some like these impulse effects, it's going to be very hard for you to be able to whiff. And even if you do, you end up finding some like land drops or maybe some other of these like cantrip type effects that you're going to be able to cast on your next turn anyway. So as long as your opponent doesn't really hit your cost reducer, or even if they do, more than likely you've flipped over another one, so you're able to kind of play it and then kind of continue on as normal. So I think that a lot of early interaction for this deck is something that you need to be able to beat it. And as Storm, this might be one of the times where I would say it's okay to kind of just, especially in the sideboard games, where if you think you're pretty close or whatever, that you can just kind of go for it and just kind of hope that your opponent doesn't, that you don't fizzle and your opponent follows up with, something like absolutely backbreaking. Because I feel like a lot of times, a lot of the mistakes I made is like I just waited where I was like, oh, I can play around, a hate piece or two, I have the potential, and then it's like, oh, well, that's like the one piece that I can't play around with this hand, so I'm stuck kind of spinning my tires to figure it out at that point. Where if I would just went for it, like it wasn't guaranteed that I could have gotten there, but definitely in a better position than like, oh, well, I'm gonna be stuck drawing for 5 or 6 turns while my opponent gets to slowly apply pressure to the board while also leaving up additional interaction for me as well. So that's kind of like my takeaway from it. I definitely have not played so much of it where I can be like an expert on the Storm deck, but definitely in like my early playthroughs and kind of my feelings on the deck is that there's definitely some appropriate times where maybe it's close, or like, oh, I have to go for it now or I lose. I don't think you necessarily need to wait for those situations. It just kind of comes with figuring out how and when to go for it, and kind of getting that feeling of like, okay, well, like I need to do this now because this, and this can happen, and my opponent's kind of telegraphing that sort of thing. So yeah, that's the Ruby Storm deck for Modern. I think that this is a very, very good option for the format currently. As long as you're willing to, just admit like, hey, I'm probably going to lose some games. I'm going to lose some sideboarded games where my opponent just drew 3, 4, 5 hate pieces and I can only play through like 2 of them. That's just something that if you're willing to be okay with from time to time, then, this is a very good option. I think this is a very potent option to pick up as well. So, but yeah, that's going to do for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what Modern deck you would like to see next. I'll just kind of like cycle through some of the top tier decks as we kind of move on through this post-Nadu format and Grief format as well. Of course, subscribe to the channel. I already said that. Follow me on Twitter/X. Follow me on, or join the Discord server. All those are in the description down below, as well as the deck list that you see on your screen if you want to copy the deck and try it out yourself. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.